The sun was beginning its slow descent beyond the rim of the prairie, painting the western sky in bruised colors, amber bleeding into violet, the faint shimmer of gold clinging to the horizon as though reluctant to let go. Dust rose from the wagon wheels as Clara walked alongside the driver, her worn leather boots crunching against the hard-packed trail. She carried no more than a small bundle tied with rope, her whole life wrapped in a single piece of cloth. The rest of her worth she kept hidden in her chest, a heart that had been hardened by loss but still flickered, faintly, with hope. Ahead, the ranch appeared like a mirage against the fading light. It was vast, sprawling across acres of rolling grass, its fences stretching toward the far hills. Horses grazed lazily in the fields, their coats glowing like molten copper under the setting sun. Smoke curled upward from the main house chimney, signaling warmth, food, and life. Clara paused, clutching her bundle tighter, and whispered to herself, "This is it. This is where it begins again." Her hands were calloused from years of working kitchens in saloons and boarding houses, her back accustomed to bending over wooden tables scarred by knives and time. But this job was different. She had been hired to cook for 12 men, a dozen cowboys who broke their backs under the merciless sun, men whose appetites matched the size of the frontier. The thought of feeding so many mouths both frightened and steadied her. Cooking had always been her way of surviving, of carving out dignity in a world quick to dismiss women as little more than shadows. When the wagon stopped, Clara slid down carefully, boots sinking into the dust. A ranch hand waved, directing her toward the kitchen. She nodded silently, brushing her skirts down, aware of the curious eyes that followed her. She was used to looks, though. In towns, men had looked at her like she was something to be bargained for, a face framed by desperation. But here, the looks seemed more puzzled than predatory. Cowboys squinting under wide-brimmed hats, trying to place who this girl might be and what business she had arriving alone at twilight. Clara ignored them. She walked straight to the kitchen door, its wooden frame weathered, the paint peeling in strips. She stepped inside, and the scent of smoke and old wood enveloped her. It was a simple room. A large stone hearth dominated one wall. A row of shelves sagged under the weight of jars filled with flour, beans, and dried herbs. A heavy oak table sat in the center, scarred and pitted, but sturdy. The place felt forgotten, like it hadn't heard laughter or smelled bread in a long time. She dropped her bundle on the table and went straight to the hearth, striking flint until sparks caught kindling. Soon flames licked upward, and warmth filled the room. Clara exhaled, her shoulders softening. She reached for cornmeal, set a pot of water to boil, and within moments the air grew thick with the comforting smell of bread rising and stew simmering. Outside, the sound of laughter swelled. 12 voices, rough with whiskey and dust, rose together. Shouts, curses, bursts of song carried by the wind. Clara's hands worked quickly, chopping onions, slicing carrots, stirring a pot with a steady rhythm. She was determined to prove herself before they even crossed the threshold. She would not be pitied, she would not be dismissed. This kitchen was her ground, her place of command. But as the night deepened and the men drifted closer, she heard something beyond the boisterous laughter. A silence, subtle but sharp, woven through the noise. She glanced through the open window and saw him. He sat apart from the others, a tall figure leaning against the corral fence. The brim of his hat shadowed his face, but Clara didn't need to see clearly to recognize the way his shoulders sloped, the way his hands rested still on his knees. Even in shadow she felt the weight of his gaze, or rather, the way he refused to look at her at all. Her chest tightened. The years fell away in an instant, and she was a girl again, standing behind the old church, the evening wind tangling her hair as a boy pressed something cold into her palm. A ring, simple, made of silver so worn it nearly dulled. He had whispered, his voice trembling with hope, both fragile and fierce. "One day, Clara, when I've got a ranch of my own, when I can give you more than dreams." She had believed him, believed with all the faith a young girl could muster, but he had vanished, a letter that never came, a promise that dissolved into silence. And now he was here, sitting among 11 strangers, pretending not to know her. Clara's hands trembled, and the knife slipped, nicking her finger. She hissed softly, pressing the wound. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on the bread browning in the oven, the stew bubbling low. She could not afford to show weakness, not now, not when her whole survival depended on holding steady. The door burst open, and the cowboys piled in. Dust and sweat clung to them like armor. They filled the room with their laughter, their boots pounding against the wooden floor, their hats tossed carelessly onto hooks. One by one they slumped into chairs, pounding fists on the table, calling out for food. Clara moved swiftly, ladling stew into bowls, placing bread in the center of the table. She smiled politely, but spoke little. She felt eyes upon her, hungry in more ways than one, but she ignored them. She was used to hunger. Then through the noise she felt it again, that silence, a presence near the doorway. Clara lifted her eyes, and there he was. He had not joined the laughter, had not pushed past the others. He stood in the shadow of the frame, his hat still low, his eyes unreadable. For a moment their gazes met. Clara's breath caught. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He looked away first. He always had. Clara forced herself to turn back to the stew, but her pulse thundered in her ears. She told herself it didn't matter, that the past was gone, that she was here to cook, to survive, and yet her heart whispered otherwise. Outside, the last light of day bled away, and the prairie sank into darkness. Inside, the kitchen glowed with firelight, 12 cowboys feasting, and one silent man, standing in the shadows, carrying a secret both he and Clara had buried, but not forgotten.
The kitchen was small, built of rough-hewn logs that carried the smell of wood smoke and years of labor. Clara's hands moved with practiced care, kneading the dough, stirring the pot, and laying out cornmeal for bread. Every movement was quiet, deliberate, as though each recipe carried the weight of more than hunger. It carried her survival. The laughter outside grew louder, 12 men jostling, calling to one another, their boots crunching against the dust. There were voices of a world that Clara had never quite belonged to, yet had been forced to serve. And in that glow of firelight, memories began to surface, unbidden, unwelcome, yet impossible to silence. She remembered a spring afternoon in a different town, where sunlight filtered through budding trees, and she was not yet hardened by loss. She remembered standing beneath the cottonwoods with him, the boy with quiet eyes and hands that trembled when they brushed against hers. His voice had been low, uncertain but honest, a promise spoken not in grand declarations, but in a vow only the two of them would ever hear. "Someday, Clara, when I've earned enough, when I can give you more than dreams." Life, however, had no mercy. His work had taken him far, beyond the borders of the town they had once called home. Clara had lost more than she could count, her parents, the roof over her head, and the softness of girlhood. She learned to cook because it kept her alive. She learned to smile because it made others stop asking questions. She learned to bury that spring afternoon in silence, convinced it was nothing but a childish pledge carried off by the wind. Surely he had forgotten. Surely she was alone in remembering. The bread rose in the oven, the stew thickened, and Clara wiped her hands on her apron, forcing herself to focus on the present. But then she felt it, a gaze, not one of hunger for food, nor the careless glances of rough men waiting for supper. It was steady, uncertain, almost fragile, as if the weight of years pressed behind it. Clara looked up through the haze of the kitchen fire, and her breath caught. Among the 12 men, one sat apart, his hat low, his hands restless on the table, as though he didn't trust them to stay still. And when she met his eyes, dark, familiar, trembling, her heart clenched like a fist. It was him, the boy who had once sworn himself to her in the shade of cottonwoods. Except now he was a man, broad-shouldered, weathered by trails and storms. His silence was not from indifference, but from fear. Fear that he had no right to speak, no right to remind her of a promise time had nearly erased. Clara's spoon stilled in her hand. The stew simmered, forgotten. For the briefest moment, the years melted away, and she was back in that spring meadow with the boy who had whispered her name as though it were sacred. Only now, the silence between them was filled with 12 other voices, laughter too loud, boots too heavy, a world too hard. And yet, the fire in the stove was not the only warmth in that room.
The long wooden table creaked under the weight of heavy plates and iron pots. Clara moved swiftly between the stove and the table, her apron brushing against her legs as she served the men one by one. Stew ladled into tin bowls, bread broken into rough halves, steam rising to meet the smell of sweat and leather that clung to the air. The cowboys filled the room with their noise, chatter about the day's work, about the herd, about the fight nearly breaking out between 2 stubborn bulls. Their voices rolled over each other, laughter echoing like thunder in a canyon. Clara had grown used to that kind of sound, the sharp edges of men who lived hard and slept harder. But tonight she could hardly hear any of it. Every step, every gesture was pulled taut by the awareness of one presence. He sat at the far end of the table, where the shadows from the lantern seemed to protect him. He hadn't spoken much, not like the others. His hands toyed with the edge of his bowl, his fork, anything but the weight of his own stillness. Yet whenever Clara moved close, she could feel it, the flicker of his gaze burning and retreating, as though each glance was both a confession and a plea. She set a bowl before him, and for the first time that evening their hands almost touched. Not fully, not enough for the others to notice, just the whisper of closeness, the memory of a promise folded inside a simple motion. His eyes lifted then, and she saw the storm inside them. Years of distance, guilt, longing, 1,000 unsaid words pressed behind his silence. Clara's breath caught. The room carried on around her, spoons clattering against bowls, men slapping each other's shoulders, voices telling stories too loud to matter. Yet all of it blurred into nothing. There was only the momentary recognition between 2 people who should not have known each other, who were supposed to be strangers here. But they weren't. They had never been. She lowered her gaze quickly, afraid someone might read the truth written so plainly in her expression. He too looked away, his jaw tightening, as if holding back words that threatened to escape. The tension between them was invisible to the others, yet it filled the space like smoke from a fire, curling through every breath they took. One of the cowboys called for more bread, jolting Clara back to herself. She tore the loaf with more force than she intended, her hands shaking slightly. When she placed the bread down, she stole another glance toward him. His shoulders were hunched, as though carrying a weight he could not set down, and yet his eyes found hers again, just for an instant. That instant was enough. No one else noticed. To the other men, supper was supper. A woman's cooking was just a comfort at the end of the day. But between Clara and the silent cowboy at the far end of the table, the meal became something else entirely. A battlefield of restraint. A quiet recognition that neither of them could name, but both could feel with unshakable certainty. The promise of the past had returned, uninvited, in the middle of a ranch kitchen filled with firelight and laughter. And though not a word was spoken, the weight of that vow pressed heavier than any noise in the room. The fire in the great stone hearth had burned low, leaving the room thick with shadows and the smell of smoke. Dinner plates scraped clean were shoved aside, mugs of coffee clinked against the wood, and the men's laughter ebbed into the softer hum that always came when the workday had worn them thin. Clara moved silently through the space, her apron streaked with flour, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, gathering dishes one by one. She tried to keep her gaze steady, to let her body follow the rhythm of habit, bend, collect, turn, stack, yet every motion was an effort to keep her trembling heart from giving her away. At the far end of the table, the quiet cowboy still lingered in the same posture, his eyes downcast, his hands restless. He had not said much through supper. He never did, Clara remembered. Silence was always his armor, the way he carried himself in a world too eager to steal words and twist them into something dangerous. But it was too late for armor. Twice now she had caught his eyes on her, not openly, not in front of everyone, but in those stolen moments when the noise drowned out the truth. And twice she had looked back, just for a breath too long. One of the cowboys noticed. It was Seth, the youngest of the crew, sharp-eyed and restless, always eager for mischief when the day's chores were done. He leaned back in his chair, balancing on two legs, and let his gaze follow Clara as she reached for a bowl near the quiet man's place. His lips curled as if he had stumbled upon some secret, though he could not yet name it. "You're real gentle with him," Seth said, casually, loud enough for a few others to hear. The words seemed harmless, just banter tossed into the air, but they landed heavily, sharper than intended. Clara froze with the bowl in her hands, forcing a smile, though her pulse thudded in her throat. "I'm gentle with all of you," she replied, voice steady, though her hands betrayed her with a small tremor. Laughter rose from the men nearest him, rough and teasing, the kind that meant nothing on the surface, but always carried the threat of something deeper. Clara turned away, pretending not to hear, and carried the dishes to the wash basin. The quiet cowboy, her betrothed, the one she had not dared to name, kept his head low, his shoulders drawn tight like a bowstring. But Seth wasn't finished. "You see that?" he said, nudging the man beside him. "The way she looks at him, like he's someone special." The word spread like a spark through dry grass. A few of the cowboys chuckled. Some leaned forward, glancing between Clara and the man at the end of the table, testing the air for truth. Others shook their heads, brushing it off as nothing more than a young fool stirring trouble. Clara felt the weight of their eyes and wished she could vanish into the shadows. She forced her hands into the soapy water, scrubbing hard at a tin plate, her breath shallow, her heart hammering. "Leave it," muttered one of the older men, Tom, his voice rough with weariness. "Don't go making trouble where there ain't none." But the room had already shifted. Once suspicion takes root, it doesn't easily let go. The air grew heavier, filled with an unspoken curiosity. She could feel it pressing against her back as she worked, the sense that every movement, every glance was being measured, compared, weighed against the story Seth's words had suggested. The quiet cowboy finally lifted his head. His eyes swept the room, meeting no one's gaze for long, but the warning was clear. Don't push this. Yet his silence, the very thing that had always protected him, now seemed to confirm what no one dared to say outright. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and turned, her face calm, though her heart was not. You men work hard, and you deserve a meal without foolish teasing. Her words carried a gentleness that might have soothed the moment, but Seth only smirked, unwilling to let go. Didn't mean no harm, he said, but the glint in his eyes betrayed him. Just think it's curious, is all. She don't look at the rest of us like that. Silence fell. The men glanced at one another, some uncomfortable, others intrigued. Clara felt her cheeks burn, though she kept her voice level. Maybe because the rest of you don't sit so quiet. Makes a woman wonder what you're hiding. Laughter broke out again, rough but less sharp this time. The tension thinned, though it didn't vanish. Suspicion, once awakened, lingered like smoke after a fire. When the men finally drifted out to the yard, leaving behind the dregs of coffee and crumbs of bread, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned to find the quiet cowboy still at the table, his eyes fixed on her, steady now, no longer retreating. For a long moment they did not move, the room between them silent but alive with the weight of everything unspoken. Then he stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He didn't approach, didn't speak, but his gaze held hers as if to say, "Be careful." That night, as Clara lay on her narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen, she could not sleep. The day's exhaustion should have pulled her under, but her mind kept circling back to the dinner table, to Seth's smirk, to the eyes that had turned toward her with curiosity, suspicion, maybe even jealousy. And to him, always to him, the man who had once been her promised future, now sitting at the edge of her present like a secret threatening to break loose. Out in the bunkhouse, the cowboys laughed and argued before settling into snores. But Clara knew it was only a matter of time before the teasing became questions, and the questions became demands. And when that time came, silence alone might not be enough to protect them.
The morning came too quickly. A pale light crept over the horizon, staining the fields with silver as the men stirred from their bunks and gathered in the yard. The ranch was alive with the sounds of horses stamping, tack creaking, and voices rough from sleep. Clara stood at the kitchen window, hands gripping the sill, watching them through the thin veil of dawn. Her heart thudded against her ribs, heavier than the kettle she had lifted 1,000 times. She had not slept. The suspicion seeded at dinner the night before had rooted in her mind, growing into shapes too dangerous to ignore. Seth's grin, the stolen glances, the way silence no longer shielded them, it had all left her with the dreadful certainty that truth was no longer safely hidden. When she stepped outside, carrying a tray of biscuits and coffee, the men fell quiet for a beat. Their chatter hushed, their eyes followed her in a way that set her skin aflame. Some offered easy smiles, others turned away quickly, as though unwilling to be caught staring. But it was Seth's gaze that held her longest, too sharp, too knowing. "You treat us too well, Miss Clara," he drawled, accepting a cup of coffee with exaggerated politeness. "Almost like you're trying to keep us from noticing something." The men laughed, but there was a current beneath the sound, one that made Clara's hands tremble. She set the tray down on the table outside, her eyes flicking instinctively toward the man who stood apart. the quiet cowboy. He hadn't touched his coffee. He hadn't joined the laughter. He simply stood with his hat low, as though trying to will himself invisible. But invisibility was no longer possible. "Tell me," Seth pressed, tilting his head, his grin widening, "what's between you and our silent friend here? You look at him like you know him better than the rest of us, like there's something we don't see." The yard stilled. The men shifted uneasily, waiting for an answer, their curiosity hungry. Clara's throat closed. She forced herself to speak, her voice calm, though every word felt like stepping onto thin ice. "There's nothing between us. You boys see shadows where there aren't any." But Seth wasn't convinced. He moved closer to the quiet cowboy, circling him like a dog testing for weakness. "Then maybe he ought to say something himself. Ain't it strange how he never talks? Makes a man wonder what he's hiding?" The quiet cowboy's jaw tightened. His silence, once his shield, now hung over him like a curse. Clara felt something inside her snap. The weight of secrecy, of years buried under silence and distance, suddenly became too much to bear. She stepped forward, her voice sharper than she intended. "Enough, Seth!" The men blinked, surprised by her fierceness. "You think you're clever, stirring trouble, but you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know him, you don't know me." Seth raised an eyebrow, amused. "Then why don't you enlighten us?" Clara's breath caught. The moment had come, the fork in the road she had dreaded. She looked at the quiet cowboy, and for the first time since she had arrived, he lifted his gaze fully to hers. His eyes were steady, resolute, though fear and sorrow flickered deep within. And then, in a voice rough with disuse, he spoke. "Her name," he said slowly, "is Clara Holt. And once, years ago, I promised her she would never stand alone." The words fell into the yard like stones dropped into still water. The men stared, stunned into silence, their suspicion now given a name, a story. Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. She had not heard his voice in so long. To the others, it was a revelation. To her, it was a vow remembered. The murmurs began at once. "You mean to say they're betrothed? Why didn't anyone know?" Seth scowled, his grin finally breaking. "So it's true. All this time you two been keeping secrets." The quiet cowboy stepped forward then, his shoulders squared, his voice steady, though low. "It wasn't meant to be a secret. Life, it got in the way. Work, hardship, loss. I kept my word in silence because I thought I had no right to speak it aloud anymore. But don't mistake my quiet for shame." Clara's breath trembled out of her, her body aching with the release of truth. She wanted to speak, but the moment was his, and she let him hold it. Seth sneered, unwilling to surrender. "You expect us to just believe it? That you two got some vow, some promise no one's ever heard of? Maybe it's just a tale to save face." The older cowboy, Tom, cut in, his voice gravelly but firm. "That boy's worked harder than any of us. Kept his head down, never stirred trouble. I believe him. And I've seen the way he looks at her. Ain't no lie in those eyes." The tension shifted. Some nodded, others stayed silent, but the sharp edge of suspicion dulled. Clara finally found her voice, soft but unshakable. "He speaks truth. Years ago, before life pulled us apart, he gave me his word. I've carried it in silence all this time because I thought it was lost. But last night, when your teasing put us under your gaze, I realized I'd rather the truth break me than live forever in shadows." Her words rippled through them, and for a moment there was quiet, deep and contemplative, as if the very air had to absorb the weight of what had been said. Seth muttered something under his breath and stalked off, the fight leaving him. The others slowly dispersed, some clapping the quiet cowboy on the shoulder, others offering nods of understanding.
And then it was just the two of them, standing in the yard, the early sun painting the dust in gold. Clara turned to him, her hands trembling as she reached for his. "You spoke," she whispered, her eyes wet. His fingers closed around hers, warm, steady. "I couldn't stay silent anymore, not when the choice was between losing you again or letting him know." She laughed through her tears, a sound fragile but bright. "I thought you'd forgotten. I thought it was only me, holding on to a ghost. I never forgot. I just thought I wasn't worthy to claim it anymore." The morning wrapped around them like a benediction. The ranch, the cowboys, the hardships, they would all still be there. But in that moment, with the sun rising and the truth laid bare, Clara felt the weight of years fall away. "You don't have to claim it alone," she said softly, pressing his hand to her heart. "It was always ours." The quiet cowboy, her betrothed, her silent guardian, nodded, his eyes shining with the promise he had carried through silence and struggle. And though no words could fully capture the vow renewed between them, both knew that this time it would not be left unspoken. The past had found its voice. The promise had found its daylight. And together they had found each other again.